University of Toronto professor Jordan Peterson has become a phenomenon. That's not an overstatement. Videos featuring him online get millions of views. His book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, is one of the biggest, maybe the biggest bestseller ever written by a Canadian author. In that book, Peterson questions the left's rhetoric on gender, and maybe for that, he's being targeted for destruction. The Guardian calls him dangerous. Vox just published a massive and almost unbelievably stupid piece accusing Peterson of, quote, reactionary politics that validate white, straight, and cisgender men at the expense of everyone else. Really mouth-breathingly stupid, but there you have it. Jordan Peterson joins us tonight. Professor, thanks for coming on. So obviously a hurt dog barks. You've done something that has made people upset. What do you think you've said that the left finds so provocative and upsetting?
Well, I pointed out quite clearly why they're factually incorrect and ideologically possessed. I mean, is particularly on issues like gender. The radical lefties insist that gender is a social construct, and that's just simply not true. So the scientific data on that are absolutely crystal clear, and no reasonable scientist disagrees. And so they're all foaming at the mouth because I'm poking holes in their cherished notions. And they like to think that people are completely malleable because that means people can be made over in their ideological image. So they're not happy about that.
So when they say your ideas are dangerous, what they're really saying is your ideas are dangerous to them.
I hope so. They're supposed to be dangerous to them. I make no bones about that. I'm not a fan of radical left.
What has your job been like back in academia? I mean, you can't be one of many people who has these views where you live and work.
Oh yeah, well no, I think they're more common than you think. I mean, my views on gender, for example, and sex, they're shared widely among people in the psychometric personality community. Anybody who studies personality and who's a credible scientist knows full well that the differences between men and women in personality are to be attributed primarily to biological factors. This isn't contentious. The only people it's contentious around are gender ideologues, and they've already lost the scientific battle, and so they've taken it to the legislative front to enforce their views. So they're really not contentious viewpoints. They're mainstream science, and I'm criticized all the time for spouting pseudoscience. It's like, it's not pseudoscience, it's mainstream science. And people who know the literature aren't disputing this. It's been known at least since the 1990s.
Well, then why are people whose views are not rooted in science, but instead in emotion and superstition, dominating our public conversation and punishing anyone who doesn't disagree? How did they get so much power?
Look, I actually think there's a technical reason for that, is that, you know, it's obvious that things can go too far on the right and they can go too far on the left. And it's kind of easy to put a box around people who go too far on the right. You can just look at claims of racial superiority. Right. But it's not so easy to put a box around people who go too far on the left. There's not a single thing you can point to that they do that has the same sort of red flag nature as claims of racial superiority. So it's hard for people who are left-leaning, say, and concerned with inequality and that sort of thing, to dissociate themselves from those who have clearly gone too far. And the problem is we really don't know where the red flags are on leftist territory. Now, for me, it's equality of outcome is a good, you know, so-called equity. That's a red flag, but it doesn't seem as immediately pathological as, say, claims of racial superiority. So it's harder for people on the left to dissociate themselves from the people who would do everyone in, essentially.
So you drew the line at pretending that biological sex isn't real. I mean, that's how you first became famous, because you said, I'm not going to lie about science. Well, do you think it's a good place for the rest of us to start?
Well, I think it's a reasonable place. I mean, the Canadian government built a social constructionist view of gender into the law, and that's just incorrect. I mean, the idea that biological sex, gender expression, gender identity, and sexual preference have no relationship to one another, that they vary independently, that there's almost nothing you could claim that's more false than that. But now it's been written into the law. Well, it's just patently absurd, and it's actually a telling commentary on the state of political discourse across the West, that something like that could even happen. Yeah. But I think it's equality of outcome that's the real pathological desire. That's a bad one.
I agree. But, I mean, I guess the good news is that taking a stand on behalf of obvious truths, there's a huge audience for it, and you're a living testament to that. Thank you, Professor. Good to see you.
No, good to see you, too. Thanks a lot.
He's a psychology professor at the University of Toronto, and he just spoke with us moments ago. Here it is. Jordan Peterson, thanks for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
We wanted to ask you the question that we think too few are asking, which is, why is this happening? Why are young men shooting up schools?
because they're nihilistic and desperate.
How'd they get that way?
Well, I think life can make you that way unless you have a purpose and a destiny, let's say. I mean, there's no shortage of suffering and malevolence in life, and it's easy for people to become embittered by that. And if they don't see a way out, see a way forward, they get angry about it and turn against life itself. And they make a display of their hatred for being by massacring the innocent. That's what's happening. And they write that.
They do write that. It's accelerating.
Yes.
The reserve of guns has, I mean, we've had semi-automatic rifles for 100 years, but we haven't had this number of school shootings. So the attitudes are changing, I think it's fair to say.
Well, it's also kind of a psychological epidemic. You know, these people keep track of each other, and there's a competitive element to it. And the fact that the media insists upon publicizing the names of these shooters is not helpful, because part of what drives them is motivation for notoriety, because notoriety is better than being ignored.
So what mistakes do you think we're making as a society to produce an ever-increasing number of young men like this?
That's a good question. I think we underestimate the necessity for young people to have clear direction and a sense of purpose in their life. They need something to offset the tragedy and malevolence of life. And we need to take these sorts of philosophical and even religious issues seriously, but we don't.
Do you think we're taking them less seriously than we used to?
Yes, definitely. I think that we talked in the past, we spoke much more about responsibility and responsibility in particular, but also purpose and maturity, and we valued those things highly. We didn't confuse them with tyranny and toxic masculinity, for example.
Speaking of toxic masculinity, why is it all boys?
Well, boys are more aggressive than girls, and there's a biological component to that that's quite strong. That's why the vast majority of people in prison are male. Like, on average, there's not much difference in aggression between men and women. If you picked a random woman and a random man out of the population and you had to bet on who was the most aggressive, if you bet it was the woman, you'd be right 40% of the time. But if you take the 1 in 100 most aggressive people, and those would be the people in prison, they're all men, or virtually all men. It's also why males attempt suicide less frequently, but they commit it successfully much more frequently. They're much more likely to use lethal means. And there's a very powerful biological component to that, despite what the postmodern social constructionists have to say about it. But they've got their head firmly buried in the sand, so.
Yeah, no, they're resistant to the evidence and reality. We know that. So, but given that we know that boys are the ones, if there is a school shooting, who are going to be the ones committing it overwhelmingly, shouldn't we be thinking about how to raise our boys in a way that they're less likely to do this?
Yeah, I think we should be thinking about that. I mean, the book I published here, this 12 Rules for Life, is a meditation on exactly that. I've been lecturing online about the idea that responsibility is what gives life meaning, and that meaning is the antidote to the sort of nihilism and aggression and resentment that can otherwise be produced. I mean, there's no doubt that life is difficult and that people get hurt and betrayed. That's unassailable truth. You need something to offset that, and most people find that in their destiny, in their adoption of responsibility, and their willingness to make their own lives better and the lives of their families better, and to contribute to the community and to bear the burden of being nobly. And that works, but we don't think that way anymore.
You mentioned the toxic masculinity. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I've heard the phrase a lot. What does it mean in our public conversation when someone attributes the shooting to toxic masculinity?
Well, it's an attempt to smear the idea of masculinity by confusing masculine competence with tyranny. And it's part of the underlying idea that our culture is a corrupt, tyrannical patriarchy that was run by men for the advantage of men, which is a very pathological way of looking at the world, but a very common one. And if that description is accepted, then it means that masculine energy, so to speak, whether it's manifested by women or by men, that masculine energy does nothing but prop up the the tyranny of the patriarchy, and so should not be fostered. And the only people who think that way are women whose relationships with men have been extraordinarily damaged, or men who have no idea who they are, or who are trying to shirk responsibility. The idea that masculinity in its essence is somehow toxic is an absolutely dreadful idea.
I'm glad I asked you that question. Jordan Peterson, thank you. We're ordered to conform, and if anything, it's getting more conformist, from gender to immigration. Pick your issue. There's increasingly only one acceptable view, and you can be ostracized or fired for disagreeing. Many are, in case you haven't noticed. University of Toronto professor Jordan Peterson stands dramatically against this tide. He's become famous in large part because he refuses to be shamed from the public square for having his own opinions. Last week, Peterson left interviewer Kathy Newman, not a genius, speechless when explaining that people do not have the right not to be offended. Watch this.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable. That's fine. I think more power to you, as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
ha, gotcha.
You have got me. You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head.
Really one of the great interviews of all time. By the way, she said Jordan Peterson has a new book out, 12 Rules for Life. That clip is everywhere. Jordan Peterson joins us tonight. It's an honor to have you, Professor. So I've watched you for a while. I've always thought you were a truth teller. One of the chapters in your book is tell the truth. That's one of your rules. What are some of the things that you think we're forced to lie about in this moment?
Well, I don't know if we're forced. I think we make a choice. That it's sometimes a bitter choice, but that's often the case when you're deciding what to say. But my sense is often you're in a situation where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, so you might as well pick the poison you'd rather take. And you have a moral obligation to do that. So, you know, if you're going to say something unpopular and you're going to get attacked for it, that's a risk. But to shut up and pretend that you think something different is to warp your soul, and that's a much bigger risk. So
yes, it is. So why I would think that even if they didn't agree with you, that people in the media would be thrilled by the way you comport yourself, the way you respond, because clearly you're saying what you really think, and that's supposed to be our charge as journalists, is to tell the truth. Well, and yet you get met with these hostile receptions. Why do you think that is? Well,
I would say that's not universal. There's a big battle being played out in the press, say over the Kathy Newman interview. There are people who are casting her as a victim because she's been vilified as a consequence of the interview. But there's been many, many people in the media who stood forth and said that it's necessary to be able to say what you think. So it's not a battle that's over yet. Yeah, it's good. It's good. Surprising, but good.
So if you, in the book, you have a number of these rules, and Rule 5 just jumped out at me as a father. You said, here's a rule. Don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. What does that mean?
Well, it means, first of all, that you should understand that you are actually capable of disliking your children, and that because you're larger and more powerful than them, if you let them misbehave in a way that makes you dislike them, you're going to take revenge on them in a very bad way, and sometimes over decades. I've seen that as a clinical psychologist. But more importantly, if your children behave in ways that make you dislike them, assuming you're reasonable, and that might be something you want to discuss with your wife, then other people are going to dislike them too, other adults, and then they won't teach them things, and they won't pay attention to them, and they'll only smile falsely at them, and other children won't want to play with them and include them, and that's a catastrophe for your child. So it's very helpful to help your children behave in ways that make other people welcome them, because then everywhere they go, they're welcome. And there's nothing better you can do for a child than that.
Very smart. In the minute we have left, if you could pass on one piece of life advice, and this really is a book of life advice, to our viewers, what would it be?
Stop saying things that make you weak.
What does that mean?
Well, if you pay attention to what you say, you'll know that sometimes you feel like you're standing on a rock, that you're in a solid place, and I suppose that you're speaking from your heart. And other times you're saying things just to look good and just to buttress your particular status at the time, and that makes you feel weak. You sell yourself out. And if you pay attention to what you say, you can tell when you're making yourself stronger, and you can tell when you're making yourself weaker. And unless you want to be weaker, then I would say it's best to say those things that make you strong. And you can learn to do that, and it's really useful. So I would recommend practicing that because it's good for you and good for everyone else too. And so
there's a reason people obsessively watch your YouTube videos. Professor, thank you very much for joining us. Congrats on the book.
Thanks very much.